Good evening. Buckingham Palace has expressed displeasure after the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, revealed that he sought the Queen's help during the Scottish independence referendum campaign. In a BBC documentary, Mr Cameron said that in 2014 he had asked if the Queen could intervene because he was concerned Scotland was going to vote for independence. The Queen later urged people to think very carefully about the future. Conversations between the Queen and the Prime Minister are meant to be kept private. But today, Mr Cameron denied that he'd acted improperly. Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
But anyway, it's very good to work.
It is the relationship at the heart of the British state between Prime Minister and monarch. The golden rule is that everything that passes between them is confidential. Yet today, David Cameron has revealed how he encouraged the Queen to intervene in the Scottish referendum, and she acquiesced. The summer of 2014, the dominant political issue was whether Scotland would break away from the Union. As British Prime Minister, David Cameron was the man tasked with saving the Union.
We would really be desperately sad to see it torn apart.
In early September, a poll predicted that the Yes campaign in favour of Scottish independence was in the lead.
Everybody happy?
Yes, thank you.
Now, throwing protocol aside, Mr Cameron has told a BBC documentary how he and royal officials then set to work.
Conversations I had with my private secretary and he had with the Queen's private secretary and I had with the Queen's private secretary, not asking for anything that would be in any way improper or unconstitutional, but just a raising of the eyebrow, even, a quarter of an inch. We thought, make a difference. Although the words were very limited, I think it helped to put a slightly different perception on things.
The Queen's eyebrow-raising words uttered outside a Balmoral church that she hoped people would think very carefully were made out to be impromptu. In fact, they were deliberate, and we now know that Mr Cameron had had a hand in them. This morning on the Today programme, he accepted he'd been indiscreet.
I think I don't want to say anything more about this. I'm sure some people would think, possibly even me, that I've already said perhaps a little bit too much.
A few hours later, from the palace came the word displeasure. It's safe to assume that the displeasure comes from the Queen herself. However, we should not assume that David Cameron was the sole instigator of her remarks. We know that the Queen cares deeply about the unity of the United Kingdom. At the time of the Scottish referendum, several members of the royal family were trying to find some acceptable way to make their concerns known. Mr Cameron's intervention was perhaps the encouragement they were looking for. For the man who led the SNP during the referendum campaign, Mr Cameron's behaviour was completely unacceptable.
It's an astonishing thing to do. It's an even more astonishing thing to reveal. I mean, has the man got no shame whatsoever?
However, the current Prime Minister was being diplomatic.
Not only do I not comment on conversations that I may have held with Her Majesty, but I don't comment on conversations she may have held with anybody else.
The Queen has now been drawn into a disputed proroguing of Parliament and renewed controversy over the Scottish referendum. For the palace, it is double discomfort. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Buckingham Palace.
The former Prime Minister Sir John Major has accused Boris Johnson of being dishonest about his reasons for suspending Parliament. Speaking through his lawyer at the Supreme Court, Sir John said the only reason Mr Johnson wanted a longer than usual suspension of Parliament was to stop MPs interfering in his Brexit plans. The government is arguing that it is not a matter for the courts at all. Our home editor Mark Easton reports from the Supreme Court.
Sir John Major, Boris Johnson. Two Conservative Party leaders, two Prime Ministers. But today the battle over Brexit saw them turn blue on blue amid accusations of hypocrisy, dirty tricks and lies. As the Supreme Court began the final day of its hearing into whether Mr Johnson unlawfully suspended or prorogued Parliament, Sir John Major told the judges in a written note that Boris Johnson had ulterior motives and his stated reasons for ending the parliamentary session could not be true. Sir John Major's lawyer in court, Lord Garnier, accused a Downing Street staffer of falsely suggesting that John Major himself, as Prime Minister, had suspended Parliament with ulterior motives.
And it was suggested that he had prorogued for base political reasons.
The demonstrators are out on the streets again.
It was a suggestion of mudslinging. There was nothing base and political about the decision to ask the Queen to shut Parliament down early ahead of the election in 1997. In the cabinet at the time, Michael, now Lord Heseltine, has dismissed the idea as nonsense.
There is recent evidence of the Downing Street press office having been misleading in its announcements.
Lord Garnier also referred to a text sent to the BBC by a Downing Street source which said the claim that the government's considering proroguing Parliament in September in order to stop MPs debating Brexit is entirely false. It later emerged that ministers had discussed asking the Queen to suspend the session, although Number 10 maintains it wasn't to close down discussion on Brexit.
We are not concerned with when and how and on what terms the United Kingdom leaves the European Union.
Stressing their discussions have nothing to do with Brexit, the Justices today received an answer to their own question to Number 10. What would government do if they lost the case?
Now, if the Supreme Court says the suspension of Parliament was unlawful, Downing Street are considering three options, depending on the exact reasons. One, they don't need to do anything at all. Two, they bring back Parliament, but they bring forward the Queen's speech. Or three, they immediately go back to the Queen again and ask her to suspend Parliament again, but this time lawfully.
This afternoon, the government lawyer, Lord Keane, argued it should never get that far anyway, because the judges have no right to rule on the matter.
The length of each session of Parliament and the frequency between sessions is regulated by constitutional convention and not by the law.
Remain campaigner Gina Miller's lawyer argued the outcome should be the immediate recall of MPs.
But does the Prime Minister have to do anything to ensure that Parliament meets next week?
Well, it may be that the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Lord Speaker in the House of Lords will take action to ensure that Parliament reopens as soon as possible next week. It's a matter for them. And then Parliament can debate.
If they follow past practice, the Justices will come together in the next few days and each in turn will give their view, starting with the newest member of the Supreme Court and finishing with the President, Lady Hale, with a decision early next week. It is, as she said, a serious and difficult question of law. And for the world outside the courtroom, a question with profound implications for the great institutions of state, for our democracy, and for the citizens of a troubled kingdom. Mark Easton, BBC News, the Supreme Court.
Meanwhile, Boris Johnson said today that some progress is being made with Brexit negotiations in Brussels. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has tonight said he believed a deal between the two sides could be reached before October the 31st. Well, our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is in Brussels for us tonight. So is there some movement? Are they unlocking this at last?
Well, Sophie, you know, there's a lot of noise about briefings here, there and everywhere from Number 10, from EU leaders, often really contradictory as to how much progress is really being made in talks. And there's a lot of movement. The Brexit Secretary zooming around Europe, today Madrid, tomorrow Brussels. The Prime Minister jets off to New York next week to the UN General Assembly, where he'll sit down with Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel. But frankly, Sophie, there's a lot of sound, a lot of fury, a lot of spin, but not much is really changing on the ground. That Irish backstop remains the sticking point to finding a new Brexit deal, with the EU and the UK still pretty far apart as to what could and should be done. But on the positive side, EU leaders are as keen as Boris Johnson, if at all humanly possible, to find a deal next month. No one at EU side I speak to off the record thinks it's possible to find that magic solution by mid-October, that EU leaders summit here in Brussels, as the Prime Minister wants. But with the clock ticking down to that 31st of October deadline, if there's no new Brexit extension, then the wisdom here is, in that last week or so, the pressure could be on the two sides to finally roll up their sleeves, sit down together, put the posturing to one side and say, now let's really get down to work.